Hi, I'm Tom Eschen, and this is Power and Politics. There's a lot going on in the political landscape in the state of New York right now, so we get a pulse of the public with a poll. Siena Pollster Steve Greenberg joins us to discuss everything going on, especially when it comes to that 2026 gubernatorial race. We don't exactly know who the candidates are, but we know hypothetically who they could be on the Democrat and the Republican side at this point. And also, Elise Stefanik has inserted her name potentially into that race, how that impacts some of the other candidates as well. And then you have Kathy Hochul on the other side, amid some others that could run, and her favorability ratings and the impact of all of that in the grand scheme of things too. We also talk about Donald Trump and how he is seen here in the state of New York, along with some of the hot issues coming out of the now approved New York State budget. What New Yorkers have to say about that. Thanks always for listening and watching. You can listen wherever you get your podcasts, so make sure to subscribe today, or you can watch on YouTube at CBS 6 Albany.
So Steve Greenberg does join us now, the pollster with the Siena Research Institute, and we really appreciate your time. Thanks for coming in.
I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, we've got a few things to get to here, and we wanted to have you on because, of course, we're always talking about the main political figures in New York and even beyond that, but also there's some budget questions in here, too, and a lot of coverage of the state budget. So we'll get into those as time goes on here, but let's start with Kathy Hochul. I think that's always the place to start, and her favorability right now, maintaining pretty steady, right? Is that what you found?
Yeah, I mean, look, she hit her all-time low last year in September of 2024. She rebounded over the course of several months, and last month, in April, she hit her high in over a year. Her favorability was the best it had been since January of 2024. This month, it dropped a couple points, but basically stayed the same. So right now, 44% of New Yorkers have a favorable view of Kathy Hochul. 46% have an unfavorable view. Last month, it was 44 to 43%, so not much movement. And then in terms of how well is she doing her job approval rating, how well, do you approve or disapprove of the job that Kathy Hochul is doing as governor? Right now, 50% of New Yorkers approve of the job she's doing, 46% disapprove. So above water by a couple points, but not awesome, but sort of consistent with where it's been the last couple of months.
In the years and the time that you've done this, her high, how would you compare that to others' high or, even other political figures?
Yeah, I would say disappointing is the word. Take a step back for a second. New York is always considered a blue state. Why is it considered a blue state? Two reasons. 49% of the enrolled voters of the state are Democrats. Only 23% of the enrolled voters are Republican. Democrats have a better than 2-to-1 enrollment edge. When it comes to statewide elections, no Republican has won statewide in New York since 2002, when George Pataki won his third term as governor. No Republican other than Pataki has won since 1994, when Dennis Vacco was elected Attorney General. And no Republican presidential candidate has carried New York since Ronald Reagan's reelection back in 1984. So that's why New York is considered a really blue state.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that 49% of the enrolled voters of the state, Kathy Hochul's favorability has never gone above 48%. She's never hit 50%. She's never had a majority, 51% or more, say they view her favorably. First time now, Siena polling only goes back to 2005, but that's the first time in the last 2 decades that we've seen a governor not ever in their tenure have a favorability rating over 50%.
And that's across the board for voters?
That's among all voters,
All voters.
New York State voters.
Right. How about Democrats? Specifically.
Democrats have a favorable view of her. 62% of Democrats view Hochul favorably. 28% view her unfavorably. In terms of her job approval rating, a slight bit better. 70% of Democrats approve the job she's doing. 27% disapprove. But we also ask what we call the generic reelect question. If the election for governor were tomorrow, would you vote to reelect Kathy Hochul, or would you prefer, quote, someone else, unquote? Among all voters, her numbers are really bad there. 36% of all voters say they would vote to reelect her. 55%, a clear majority, say they would prefer someone else. But among Democrats alone, 51%, a bare majority, say they would vote to reelect her. 38% of Democrats. That's a significant number. More than a third of Democrats say they would prefer someone else.
Right, and someone else could be anybody, right?
And that's what we always joke about. I mean, there's the generic reelect question, but you can't beat somebody with nobody. You don't get a choice on the ballot, none of the above.
Right.
So when we look right now, and again, we're more than a year out from a potential gubernatorial primary, but when we ask Democrats if the candidates were Hochul, Lieutenant Governor Antonio Delgado, or Congressman Richie Torres, who would you support? Right now, 46% of Democrats, nearly a majority, say they're with Hochul, and 12% would be with Delgado,
Yeah.
only 10% with Torres right now. That said, Torres and Delgado are not really known to the voters of this state largely. And there's a year and a month to go before such a potential primary. So there's a lot of time for this to change.
Yeah, I'll get in the moment. We'll get into the Republican side of that, and I just want to ask about some movement with those two, as Delgado, of course, has come out as sort of an independent figure in all of this. But I did before, just in the next couple of minutes, to ask about on a grander scale Trump, and what he looks like at the state level.
Well, Siena's been polling Donald Trump since the early 20-teens, long before he decided to run for president, because there was a rumor back in like 2010 that he might run for governor.
Right.
So we've been polling on him a long time. Donald Trump has never been popular in New York, not before he was president, not while he was president the first time, not in between, and not now as president the second time. Currently, 38% of voters view Trump favorably, 59% view him unfavorably. In terms of his job approval, kind of comparable, 40% approve the job Trump is doing as president, 57% of voters disapprove. Obviously, a huge partisan divide here.
Yeah.
79% of Republicans view Trump favorably. 82% of Republicans approve of the job that he's doing.
Yeah.
So it really is Democrat versus Republican when it comes to Trump or Hochul, for that matter.
In terms of the last election in November, I know there were some gains from him, specifically in votes, even in the city, and people are saying, well, let's start to flip, New York's turning red. Are you seeing that amongst, talking to people, but outside of voting itself?
Well, that's hard to tell because, independents particularly are the ones who move races in New York.
Yeah.
And right now, for the last few years, they've been siding more on the Republican side than on the Democratic side. That could shift over time, certainly could shift depending on what's going on in Washington or Albany at any given time. But right now, independents don't love Donald Trump. 45% of independents view him favorably, 50% view him unfavorably. Break even on job approval, 46% of independents approve, 48% disapprove. But you'll note that last year, even though Harris carried New York, no great surprise, she did so by a smaller margin than did Barack Obama, than did Joe Biden, than did John Kerry when he ran for president. And that came 2 years after the most recent gubernatorial election, where Kathy Hochul only carried New York by 6 points over Lee Zeldin.
Right.
Closest gubernatorial election in decades. So the question is New York moving to red? No, absolutely not. Is it moving purple? Doesn't seem so, but what does seem apparent is it's not as dark blue as it once was. It's a little lighter shade of blue because independents have largely been siding with Republicans.
Yeah, and you go back to the gubernatorial primary on the Republican side. Elise Stefanik, after the UN nomination was dropped, she's back to being a congresswoman again, but also floating out. She hasn't declared a run, but how do voters and how do people feel about her potentially being in this race?
Sure. Well, let me couch it by saying we asked last month. We asked Republicans who they would favor for governor for next year. And that was before Stefanik made it be known that she wanted to be considered here.
Yeah, this is an interesting part. Yeah.
And so we had just Nassau County Executive Bruce Blakeman and Congressman Mike Lawler from the Hudson Valley. Last month, Blakeman led Lawler 28 to 22%, with half of Republicans saying, I don't know, it's a long ways away. This month, we added Stefanik, and she becomes the instant frontrunner. 35% of Republicans say they'd be with Stefanik, 22% with Lawler. That's the same he got last month. But Blakeman, who had 28% last month, dropped to 11%. So Republican voters know that Blakeman and Stefanik are sort of related in terms of what kind of Republicans they are, whereas Mike Lawler is seen as a different kind of Republican. So
Hmm.
her getting in the race didn't affect the fact that between a quarter and a fifth of Republicans say they're with Lawler when it's just a two-man race or a three-person race.
I'd imagine some of that is probably name recognition too for Stefanik. It admits those other two. Like you said, there's half that are like, I don't know.
Well, I mean, we'll look at it this way. When we ask the favorability question, do you have a favorable or unfavorable view? Or people will say, I don't know, I've never heard of that person, or I'm not sure. 40% of New York voters have either never heard or don't know enough to have an opinion about Elise Stefanik. 52% have never heard or don't know enough to have an opinion about Mike Lawler, and 66% of New York voters have either never heard or don't know enough to have an opinion about Bruce Blakeman. So it's the same on the Democratic side with Delgado and Torres, as we were speaking. But that's why, for them, if you're thinking about running, a poll a year out doesn't really mean anything because it's name recognition.
Right.
And these folks have an opportunity to define themselves with voters. What they have to be careful about is if hypothetically Stefanik is able to raise a lot of early money and go after, again, when candidates declare that they're in the race or something. But if she has the money advantage, she has the opportunity to define her opponents before they can define themselves. And that's something in politics, you never want to do that.
Right. And in this case, I don't think there has been a hypothetical Stefanik Hochul matchup yet.
We have not done it at Siena.
Yeah.
I know the New York Post published a poll today where they say it's a close race, but I'm not familiar with the ins and outs of that poll.
Right. You got to go behind the scenes. We'll get into some of the deeper behind the scenes of this later on in this conversation. But I did want to get, and thinking about this in terms of the statements that some of these individuals make, I guess, what do you see that actually moves the needle? Because I know, I guess you look across the board, you see, Delgado, we just talked about it here. He made the big statement he's going independent from Hochul a few months ago. You have Mike Lawler, who's on TV all the time, every other day, yet those numbers still, are what you're finding right now in terms of his recognition. Is there a statement they make, or is it consistency that moves their even name recognition?
No, not this far out from an election, not without spending lots of money to get yourself known.
Yeah.
Look, here's the perfect example. Tom DiNapoli has been the state controller since 2007. So for 18 years, he has been the state controller. He has won 4 elections statewide. In 3 of those 4 elections, he got more votes in New York than any other candidate on the ballot. And we didn't ask about him this month, but the last time we asked about Tom DiNapoli was either in March or April, I forget. But more than half of voters had either never heard of Tom DiNapoli or didn't know enough about him to have an opinion. He's been a statewide elected official, won 4 statewide elections. He's been there for 18 years. He gets coverage on Channel 6 and across upstate. He doesn't get a lot of attention in New York City, granted, but if he goes to Buffalo, Rochester, he's in the news a lot. And still more than half of New Yorkers don't know who he is. So it is really hard in this state to become known. That's why you need a fierce campaign with the ability to raise money and educate voters about you, who you are, what you stand for.
Well, when it comes to making statements now, and we're going to get into the budget here in a second, on a broad scale, and you hear Kathy Hochul a lot around budget season of, selling her case, being out there, making sure she's going to different parts of the state to tout her wins or whatever it's going to be, or try to make and convince the legislature to go along with what she's saying. Does that change the perception of what she's doing at all over the course of a few months where she's selling this budget and touting her budget wins? Do you ever see that?
We do see that in the past from time to time where, during the course of budget deliberations, we'll see a governor drop. And then when the budget gets done, the governor goes back up. With Hochul, we really haven't seen it that much.
Right. I mean, if you look at this year,
right.
in terms of the budget was passed between the last poll and this poll, right?
And
nothing really changed.
And as you said, we'll talk about this. A lot of the issues that were in the budget, voters really liked, and not just Democrats. There are a lot of things that were in this budget that enjoy broad bipartisan support. but it doesn't seem to reflect on her.
Hmm.
Again, I go back to, in a state where 49% of the voters are Democrats, how does she never get above 50% favorability?
Interesting. And she said, and it wasn't in this one, I don't believe, but in the past, we might have done it, is I believe when the budget was late, she said, New Yorkers don't care if the budget's late. Is that something you've ever asked? Do they care?
Well, they say they do.
Yeah.
But does it really have a real effect? So last
Yeah.
month, when the budget was late, we asked voters about it, and a strong majority of voters said that they were concerned, that they were not happy that the budget was late.
Yeah.
But they don't tend to take it out on legislators come election day. There are more pressing issues come next November. There will be more pressing issues for voters when choosing whether to go, vote Democrat or Republican for governor. Then, gee, Kathy Hochul's budgets were late 5 years in a row. Doesn't seem to impact the way voters vote.
Yeah. Let's get to some of the things that were a little bit more, I guess, because they may be closer when it came to the favorability of some of these issues. Inflation rebate checks.
Yeah.
We've talked about that a lot since she introduced that a few months ago.
Yeah, no, and they don't do great with voters. Right now, 45% of voters say they support the inflation refund checks that were in the budget. 38% oppose it. There's a partisan divide, but it's not huge partisan divide. Democrats support it by a 53 to 31% margin. Independents oppose it by a 45 to 33% margin. And interestingly, Republicans are between Democrats and independents. They oppose, but barely, 44 to 42%.
And that's an interesting one to me because it does go deeper into how people look at money. You don't hear about people turning down $200, whatever, $300.
And maybe more surprising than that partisan divide, which wasn't very big, is the income divide. Voters who have a household income of $50,000 or less support these rebate checks 42 to 37%, only by 5 points. Voters who have a household income of $50,000 to $100,000 support it 48 to 36%. And voters who make $100,000 or more support it 46 to 40%. So not a large income divide. You would think lower income folks would say, yeah, send me that $300 check.
But it tells you that in this case, the voters have more intuition about where this money's coming from and the grander scheme of we need a more consistent, I guess, cash flow, right?
Yeah.
Just looking at it from my perspective.
Absolutely. I mean, we didn't ask voters, why do you not like it? But
yeah,
I mean, that's certainly a plausible reason.
Yeah. The other element was the governor's ability to make mid-year cuts if the revenues don't come in that they expect. This was another thing I've spoken to lawmakers about on both sides of the aisle that there's some frustration about, but obviously we just had, at least in Congress, a budget passed that some people are concerned about on one side of the aisle and even some Republicans.
Well, only through one house so far.
I know, we got to figure out what it looks like in the Senate. But the ability for the governor, and they've already talked about potentially coming back in the fall to make more changes, but the governor having this power, how do voters feel about that?
Interesting. Again, it's sort of mixed, although positive. Voters support this measure by a 42 to 27% margin. So a 15-point cushion, but only a plurality, 42% of voters. What I find interesting about this one is Democrats supported 2-1, 45% to 21%. Republicans supported 41 to 32%. Independents, they're divided, 36-35. It's rare that you see Democrats and Republicans agree and independents be the outlier.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, for sure. Now I want to get to the legal fee aspect because that's been another point of consternation here. I spoke to Letitia James yesterday about this and say, do you think it's a fair use of taxpayer money? She said, well, this has always been a part of the budget of this public figure of being able to supply their legal fees, even for private matters in this case too. So this is the $10 million in the state budget that's been allocated, set aside for outside legal fees for public officials. How do voters feel about that?
Totally mixed. 41% support it, 40% oppose it. We do have the partisan divide here. 56% of Democrats support this, 65%, nearly 2/3 of Republicans oppose it, and a majority of independents by a 51 to 32% margin oppose it.
Yeah, that's an interesting that's an interesting one for me, because I've spoken to some Democrat lawmakers who say, she's doing the work and this is happening because of that. So, we do think this is a good idea. But like you said, on the other side of the aisle, even some Democrats are saying, well, should this really be a thing, right?
Well, but right now we see Andrew Cuomo is getting his legal bills paid by the state.
Yeah.
In past, we've seen Joe Bruno, a Republican Senate leader back in the day, get his legal bills paid for by the state. So it's certainly not unprecedented. But at the moment, Democrats are good with it. Everybody else, not so much.
I guess that does beg the question, if it was flipped, if these were Republicans that were getting investigated by the DOJ.
Would they feel different?
Right, yeah, which they very well might. Let's get a bit into the weeds here. I want to know who you're talking to, how you're talking to them to get these numbers.
Sure. Well, in this particular case, we spoke to a sample of 805 registered voters.
Okay. We
should point out that all the public pollsters do different kinds of polls at different times of the year. So here we are in May of 2025. We're a long way from an election. Who knows who's a likely voter in the election next year? So we don't even bother. So this is a sample of 805 registered voters. Our sample looks like the New York electorate by geography, by race, by religion, by gender, by age, by education, by income. We make sure that we have a sample that looks like the 11 million registered voters in this state.
How do you reach those voters?
Largely through phone calls. In this particular one, about 500 were done through direct phone calls, and we have people who pick up the phone, dial, and talk to real callers talking to real voters on the phone. For a couple hundred every month, about 300 this month, we use what's called a panel. So there are companies that run these large panels, and so we will tell them we want a random sample of New York State registered voters, and they will produce a panel, and then it's done via text and through the computer.
In terms of getting people, in this day and age, and this is something I'm curious about, is it hard to get people to pick up the phone? I guess it's become more difficult to be able to conduct this work in a way where you're finding the right demographic of people, because there are either a certain person that's going to pick up the phone and there's a certain person that's not. Right?
Absolutely. And it gets harder and more challenging as time goes on. You'll see pollsters trying text to web and all kinds of other methods to make sure you can get a representative sample to participate in the poll. Look, if we go back 50 years, everybody had a home phone. Most people didn't have caller ID, so the phone rang, you picked it up. Hi, I'm Steve. I'm calling from the Siena College Research Institute. Can I ask you a few questions? Oh, sure. And then we made the conversion. Well, you can't just call landlines because a lot of people don't have landlines anymore. They just use cell phones. So the vast majority of all our phone calls are going to cell phones these days. There's still some to landlines, but not as many. But yeah, it's hard. And so a lot of phone calls have to be made to get the 800 that we need in this sample.
How long does it take?
This was done between May 12th and 15th. So over the course of 4 nights.
Is there a time of day? You said nights?
Well, mostly nights, but there's some afternoon calling as well, because you can reach some people in the afternoon that you can't reach at night.
Is there, do you ask them all of these questions, or do you just ask some of the questions?
Oh, no. When we put out a poll and we put out the list of the actual wording of the question in the order we asked the question, so that the public, there's transparency, the public knows. We didn't have... Before we asked the question about Kathy Hochul, we didn't sneak in a question like, don't you think she's the worst governor ever?
Right.
Yes. So everybody gets asked. Now, sometimes people hang up halfway through. They get thrown out because we don't ask the demographic questions till the end. Your age, your income, your education, So that's what we need to be able to make sure we have a representative sample. So if somebody answers the first 25 questions out of the 36 substantive questions in this poll and then all the demographics, unfortunately, we wasted some time because we can't use that.
So you will, if for some reason it doesn't align with the demographic, even after you're done.
No, once we're done and we have the demographics, we can fit them in because we can wait to ensure that we have the right demographic along all the all the demographic groups.
Interesting. What's next? What's the next one?
Oh, well, I mean, what we try to do is we try to do a monthly poll of New York.
Yeah.
Not 12 a year, generally 10 a year.
Yeah.
So we'll have one next month in June after session ends to see how, what passes in the legislature and whether people like it or not.
Yeah.
And then we'll have one in the summer and a couple throughout the fall. We'll also be looking at national politics with the New York Times. And we'll see what else. But, we're never more than a year and a half from a major election. And that's where we are right now.
Yeah. Interesting. Steve Greenberg, thanks for coming in. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Hit the subscribe button right now so you can stay up to date on these news-making conversations about the issues impacting New Yorkers the most: power and politics.